commemorating, I wouldn't say celebrating, but commemorating the 21st anniversary of Guantanamo. I mean, if there's anything that could be actually described as a stain on the conscience of the West, and there are many, many stains, but I'm going to single out Guantanamo. It's been around for 21 years. A paralegal sphere, a world that doesn't really belong to anyone in particular. It doesn't belong to the Americans. It doesn't belong to the Brits. And I'm talking here about nations. No jurisdiction, supersedes that of Guantanamo. It's almost unbelievable. We're talking about bastions of democracy, in today's terms, but still 21 years. And Moazzam, you happen to spend some of those 21 years inside.
Well, Anas, 21 years in the West is the year of coming of age, isn't it? When you reach 21, that is, you are actually seen as an adult. So there are kids now who have grown into adults, including some of the children of the men held in Guantanamo. I just came back recently from Morocco, and met a man who'd been held, Abdul Latif, for 20 years without charge or trial.
Abdul Latif
Nasser, yeah. And recently, just a couple of guys, Pakistani
without
guys,
trial, without charge.
No charge.
20 years.
Yeah. No. So there's no court case. Essentially, no need for legal representation because there are no laws.
There aren't any charges.
There's nothing. I mean, and I just recently, spoke to a young boy called Jawad in Pakistan. His father was cleared for release alongside his own brother because they're both in Guantanamo. They've been there for 21 years.
Oh my!
He's never met his father, and his father's never been charged with a charge or crime. And this isn't some deepest, darkest developing nation. This is America, as you said.
We're not talking here about some sort of fictional tale. We're not talking about a John le Carré sort of novel. We're talking about something in reality which was experienced by hundreds of human beings.
Well, and I think as well, mentioning family members is really crucial because every acceptable prison around the world where the law applies, people who have been convicted of crimes, however terrible those crimes are allowed family visits. At Guantanamo, even if your family could somehow raise the money to fly out to this remote prison on a naval base in Cuba, you are not allowed to. Wow. It's the only example that I know of where you're just completely cut off. And for most of Guantanamo's history, people didn't have any access to their families at all. Now I think they set up Zoom calls. They're allowed to communicate.
Yeah. Every few months, yes. Every few months,
but it was nothing. And it's just one example of the lawlessness of Guantanamo, of what happens when a country like the United States that claims to respect the rule of law tears up all of its domestic and international laws and treaty obligations, as they did after 9/11, and sets up a place like Guantanamo.
It's, when we talk about 21 years, it makes me at least feel really old because my second son is not yet 21. So basically, his entire lifetime, there were people who were locked inside who had absolutely no rights, who were subject to some of the most obscene forms of torture, who have endured, oppression and conditions that are unimaginable to those who haven't tried them. You, Moazzam, you might have witnessed or seen or experienced yourself, but we're talking about an establishment that was set up as an act of retribution, and I can't find a more apt description than this, that it was an act of vengeance rather than an act of justice.
That's the point, isn't it? Because if it was an act of justice, of seeking justice, George Bush said that people in Guantanamo Bay are now seeing American justice. Well, that's an oxymoron, because to hold people for this long and to be vetted by or questioned by the world's most powerful intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and still at the end of that, not a single person has been found guilty of their involvement in 9/11. The reason why Gitmo was set up.
Incredible.
So you've had all these people released, Osama bin Laden's bodyguards, senior Taliban members who are now ministers in their government.
Wow.
All of that's happened. And yet still there are people like the Rabbani brothers who are neither members of Al-Qaeda, neither members of the Taliban, and still held there without charge, without trial, because they are poor, innocent Muslims who have nobody to advocate for them.
Andy, remind me, how many people have gone through the doors of Guantanamo?
779 people have been held by the US military at Guantanamo. There was a 6-month period where the CIA ran one of its secret black site torture prisons within Guantanamo. So there was another man who was held there but was never actually held in the prison population of Guantanamo. That's why sometimes you see 780 prisoners referred to. Yeah. But yeah, 779.
And how many still remain there?
There are 35 men still held at Guantanamo.
Wow.
Yeah.
And amongst them are the father and the brother.
The Rabbani brothers. Yeah. And there is, of course, there's several individuals. There's this Khalid Sheikh Mohammed who's supposed to be the mastermind. But there's also a crucial case, the case of Abu Zubaydah. And that really is one of the most horrific cases. The entire US torture program was based upon trying to extract information from him. He was tortured in Thailand, in Poland, in Lithuania, in Romania. He's actually, if you could actually believe this, right, because of the role of the CIA in his torture, all of the European countries that I've mentioned, Poland, Lithuania, and Romania, have been forced by the European Human Rights Court to compensate him hundreds of thousands of euros whilst he's in Guantanamo for their role in facilitating his torture.
Wow.
And he's done a whole series of self-portraits of torture that were published in the New York Times, which are really horrific. One of them, and I'll just give an example. He's in a coffin. He describes how he's in a coffin. He's naked. He's soiled himself, and he wants to pray in a coffin. And I've asked this question, at a mosque once. I said, can any imam tell me the fiqhi ruling, the Islamic ruling on how do you pray naked in a mosque, in a coffin?
Wow.
And I wanted him to think about this when we have all that other kind of bickering going on. As it gets some context, please.
Incredible. But okay, so here's a very simplistic, call it even naive question. Why till now? Why those 35 still? Why?
Well, I think we have to go back to the very beginning, which is that the prison was set up outside the law. So the men held at Guantanamo were held without any rights whatsoever as human beings. No rights, no body that they could appeal to say, you might have made a mistake here, or no body they could appeal to say, is this forever? Will I get any kind of due process? Nothing. It's really crucial just to dwell for a moment on that foundational truth about Guantanamo, a prison where people were absolutely held with no rights whatsoever. And so everything that has happened since then has involved either politics. So pretty much everyone was supporting George W. Bush at the beginning. And then when people started to hear about how bad Guantanamo was, then government started to feel a bit of pressure. And so government started to say, we need our guys back now. This is all political. This didn't involve the law. Lawyers, meanwhile, fought for years to get the prisoners the right to go before a court to ask why they were being held. The great writ of habeas corpus, which the barons imposed on King John over 800 years ago, and which over centuries developed to protect all of us, supposedly from executive overreach. After long legal struggles, the men finally secure habeas corpus rights. Those are then taken away by Congress and reinstated in 2008. And for a 2-year period, the law applied at Guantanamo. So men's cases went before judges in the US district courts who looked at the government's supposed evidence and said, you have failed to demonstrate, even with a very low burden of proof, that these people were involved in any meaningful way whatsoever with Al-Qaeda or the Taliban or other associated forces. And these men were released. Over 30, I think, were released as a result of
during those 2 years.
During these 2 years, from 2008 to 2010.
Right.
Then essentially right-wing appeals court judges started changing the rules governing the habeas cases.
Sorry, on this, what happened to allow for those 2 years to be governed as such? Was it the fact, because those 2 years obviously coincided with the first term of Obama, and he ran his campaign on closing Guantanamo? I mean, I remember this very, very well. And many, many people celebrated Obama's coming because he was going to do this.
One thing is that it's like, it's putting the knife in the back, putting it a few inches back and saying, didn't we do you a favor? As Malcolm X says. Yeah. George Bush got all those people imprisoned, but he released the largest number of people as well. So it's not like Obama was doing any particular favors for anybody. If anything, while he was doing the extra or maintaining the extrajudicial detention, he was doing the extrajudicial killing. So the use of drone strikes in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Afghanistan, and later in Libya.
And by the way, I was telling Andy earlier that in one of my many conversations with American officials, one of them had the audacity to say, well, Guantanamo, as horrific as you might paint it, but it's the best of many far worse scenarios. And I said, how could anything be far worse? He said, well, we could go around the world and kill them.
Which is what they'd been
Which is essentially what then transpired that they were doing.
It's interesting. I met the former Undersecretary for U.S. Homeland Security, who used to play golf with Bush. And he sat down with me and a bunch of other former Guantanamo prisoners in a private meeting. And he said, after we told him some of our stories and the stories of others, including our children being born while we're in Guantanamo, we don't even get to see them. And he hears it in an English accent, in a British accent, which sounds to him a little bit more familiar than, say, somebody that comes from a world that he doesn't recognize. And he said, and I quote, "If Bush was to hear you speak, I think he'd have a tear in his eye."
Oh my!
So I didn't know what to make of it. But he also said that we'd like to, and it's the only time I've ever heard this from a U.S. official, that we'd like to bring in the process of somehow starting to say that we're sorry.
When was this?
This was 2011.
Wow!
And it was him and alongside a former U.S. general. They were part of the remember the detainee treatment project led by Senator, I forget the one that was held prisoner in Vietnam.
McCain.
Yeah, John McCain. Yeah,
right.
Okay. It was him who'd helped to set up that program, and it reported. Yeah. And it was essentially around the time, a couple of years later, the US did a Senate report on torture, which is that famous report by Senator Dianne Feinstein's office, in which they recognized that over 119 prisoners were subjected to the torture program, including Abu Zubaydah, who, as Andy said earlier on, and remember, he said, are these prisoners supposed to be here forever? Well, that is one of the categories. It's an actual category in Guantanamo called the forever prisoners, meaning, and this is what they say, he's too innocent to charge and too dangerous to release. Look at that. What a category we've created in
this
21st
is the thing.
century.
I mean, I still want to come back to those particular 2 years and how then we sort of push back. But this is what gets me. The fact that in countries that are seen around the world as being democratic and being transparent and being upholding of values such as justice, such as equality, such as freedoms and the like, that a country such as the United States can actually set up an entire sphere, an entire life that is outside the jurisdiction of any law, and then come up with absolutely ludicrous statements such as this, or classifications such as what you've just mentioned. It's just absolutely mind-boggling.
Well, Andy actually made a film called Outside the Law, which is essentially, it was screened all around the country, and we even went to show it in Poland, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Where some of the torture of Abu Zubaydah had taken place. We were actually talking to the lawyers together, and Andy's film was being screened in rural parts of Poland, cities. I think we couldn't pronounce their names. But it was essentially to tell the world that this is all outside the law.
And by the way, I mean, let's not forget that for many, for many, there was an initial station of detention, which was in Bagram. And many were held for some for days, some for weeks, some for months, before then being landed in
I was held
Guantanamo.
in Bagram for a year.
For 1
year, for 11 and a half months. And I saw 2 prisoners murdered by the soldiers. I saw them beaten to death by the American soldiers. Because in one instance, they found it funny that the prisoner was saying Allah every time he was kicked in his leg. And he was kicked 100 times in his leg. There's a film called Taxi to the Dark Side that won the Oscar for Best Documentary, 2008, I think it was, by Alex Gibney. And it features the story of this man, the man that I saw murdered. Now imagine, this is not in a battle zone. He's not in a military zone. Nobody's armed there. He's kicked to death by blunt force trauma, by literally kickboxing style kicks. And the prisoners, the guards receive dishonorable discharge. The really weird, I don't know if you know this, Andy, but I don't know if I told you, but almost 2 years later, after I saw this murder, I wasn't sure he was dead. There was a rumor. I was in my cell in solitary confinement in Guantanamo, and 2 CID officers, I'd never heard of the CID before, not in America. They'd come in and they showed me a photograph of Dilawar's body.
Yeah.
And that's how I first knew that he's dead. And then they showed me the photographs of the soldiers. And they said, can you recognize any of these soldiers who were on duty that night? And I pointed each one of them out. And then they asked me, would I be willing to be a witness in any potential prosecution against these soldiers? And I'm held myself without charge or trial. Can you imagine that? And I said, yes, I would be, but how are you going to do that? Are you going to take me by force? How are you going to bring me into court with a hood over my head and shackles? How are you going to do that?
And these people who were responsible for these deaths in Bagram as well were part of a group of soldiers that were then sent to Abu Ghraib in Iraq, where we eventually, for the only time, saw evidence of the abuse of prisoners.
Yeah. I mean, one of them, he's named, so he's openly talked about it, is Damien Corsetti. He was an interrogator when I was in Bagram, and he used to speak to me. In fact, he gave me a book. I've still got that book. It's called Catch-22, which is known as the anti-war novel of our times, right? Yeah. And he was brought up for charges of detainee abuse in Bagram and then in Abu Ghraib, where he was redeployed, including against females. Wow. He came out afterwards, totally traumatized, speaking out against the war, giving evidence against himself, and he became a bit of a vegetable afterwards because I spoke to him. But this is because General Jeffrey Miller, who I saw him with my eyes when was involved in setting up Guantanamo and the enhanced interrogation program, he went on to Guantanamo-ize, as he says, Abu Ghraib in Iraq. So that's the kind of causal link between let's start here, see how it goes, and practice it in Iraq.
It's, again, I, as someone who have heard of, campaigned and the such, but can never ever imagine the scale of bestiality, of depravity that was that first of all allowed for the concept of these detention centers, whether it be in Bagram, whether it be in Poland, or whether it be in Guantanamo ultimately, and imagining what was going on is something that is beyond me. But the reality is that it did. It did happen. It was going on, and apparently for 35 people, it still goes on. I mean, that's the scale. But once again, my question is, and I take this from a conversation that took place between myself and again one of the advisors to the state secretary many years ago, stating that one of the problems that faced Obama living up to his pledge to close Guantanamo was the fact that, this was his explanation, that many of the countries from which these detainees came from wouldn't have them back. And that they were, and he gave me the example of several Arab countries, for instance, who just didn't want to hear about the people. And they said, no, their citizenships have been retracted, and therefore we're not responsible for them. how much of this continuation of the existence of this stain is down to mere administrative glitches or hindrances, and how much is it because the policy remains? That policy that was introduced, and again, once, in my view, in order to seek vengeance and as a retribution for 9/11, for it carrying on until today.
Well, it was also, it was also a failed attempt to extract intelligence. I think they really did think that they. I mean, it's shameful to think people arrived at Guantanamo. They knew nothing about them because they hadn't screened them adequately in Afghanistan. Then they decided that they were all terrorists hiding secrets. So if they interrogated them and they said they knew nothing, it was because they'd been trained to resist interrogation by Al-Qaeda. So therefore, they started torturing and abusing them. And all the information they extracted through this, they claimed was worthwhile intelligence. And a lot of it, you can see in the fullest form that we got to see it in the classified files from Guantanamo that were released by WikiLeaks in 2011, on which I worked as a media partner, where you could see that, unfortunately, a number of prisoners at Guantanamo were prevailed upon through torture, abuse, or even through bribing them with better living conditions, or through exhausting them, through dragging them into cells in the middle of the night to tell lies about their fellow prisoners. So the whole thing is that releasing prisoners, the problem there comes back to what I was saying before, that after the right-wing appeals court judges shut down habeas corpus and said everything the government says must be treated as presumptively accurate. Yeah.
Is this a secret evidence?
Yeah, this is evidence that you can't get to challenge. But it's the point Andy's making is that they've made a statement. Let's just say this person is a terrorist.
That's it. It should be taken by the judge as true, as factual, as evidence.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So once habeas corpus was shut down, then the prisoners are back in a position where their release is at the political whim of the executive or Congress. The courts have ruled themselves out again of having any involvement in it. And so releasing men from Guantanamo does involve the US government having to negotiate with home governments. And I'm sure that there were cases where home governments said, we don't want these men. But the bigger problem was that primarily involved the Yemenis, but not just the Yemenis. There were Palestinians in Guantanamo. These were people who could not be safely returned to their home countries. Part of this has involved over the years Republicans passing provisions in the annual National Defense Authorization Act, which explicitly prevents the United States from sending prisoners back to Yemen and to other proscribed countries. In the case of the Palestinians, they couldn't get back to Palestine because the gatekeeper was Israel, and the Israeli government wouldn't let any former prisoners back.
Abu Zubaydah, for example, is a Palestinian. He's a stateless Palestinian. Also, this is really interesting because I've been involved with a lot of the former Guantanamo prisoners who've been returned in different parts of the world. I've visited them all over the Arab world and beyond. And it varies from place to place. Not only in some places are they not welcome, they're imprisoned straight away, but in other places, they're given a hero's welcome, literally met by the government. For example, Sami al-Hajj and all the Sudanese guys were welcomed in that way. And whenever I've traveled with Sami around the Arab world, it's not me they come to see. Everybody wants to see Sami. And the other thing about this is that I was involved in some of the resettlement discussions with countries within Europe and beyond, with some of their governments, to see if they would welcome or bring in some of the former Guantanamo prisoners because they can't return, say, to Tunisia or to Libya or beyond. And some took them and some didn't. And all of them said this to me, and including some of the foreign ministers and actual ministers, Deputy Prime Minister of Luxembourg. Well, this is America's problem. This is America's problem. Why should we solve it? But the reality is, I'll give you an example of the Uyghurs, for example, from East Turkestan in China. They can't go back to China. That's one place. And they would say, we'll rather remain in Guantanamo. We thank God we were sent to Guantanamo, not to China. So they're sent to places like El Salvador, Bermuda, Palau, Albania.
I read about, I mean, several years ago, I read about the case of someone who had been returned to, I'm trying to remember which country, so I won't mention anything just in case I'm wrong. But after a few months, he sent a plea saying, please just take me back to Guantanamo because I am being abused, I'm being humiliated, I'm being persecuted.
So there's some there was 4 sent to Kazakhstan. One of them died there. One of them, Lutfi bin Ali, couldn't get the treatment, so they managed to send him to Mauritania. He couldn't get to Tunisia in time. He also died. And this is just a lack of treatment, receiving treatment.
And one of the men who's still held there, so the 2 who survived being sent to Kazakhstan, is suffering, persecuted by the government, abandoned by the United States. And there was an article just written about him last week by a great journalist called Elise Swain, who writes for The Intercept. Covering an otherwise, completely forgotten story.
Sabri al-Qureshi, his name is.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you. This is interesting. I mean, the fact that some, and listen, whilst we're talking about this grim reality that we're all witness to, because it's happened in our lifetimes, and some of us tried, some of us, suffered, some of us did as much as we could. But let's not forget that people around the world actually condemn this as an act of inhumanity. And many continue to until this very day. I have to say that my gauge on the volume of the streets, whether it be here in the UK or across Europe, was far louder in the first 10 years than it has been over the last 10 years. And I'm not sure whether that's because the sort of British European detainees have been released and therefore to many that's the case closed, or whether we're now just basically desensitized to the fact that Guantanamo is a reality of our existence. But amongst those, I mean, you mentioned Swain, for instance, in The Intercept, but there's also Jodie Foster, who produced, directed, as well as starred in an award-winning, I believe, movie a few years ago about the Mauritanian, and that went far in sort of igniting the fervor for the closure of Guantanamo and the settling of all these cases. But I have to say that it also allowed for a false sense of, we've done our bit. See, we've admitted our mistakes. There we go. This is a Hollywood movie by a Hollywood superstar, and talking about this story and giving back this man, Muhammadu, giving back his sort of whatever was taken away from him during the many years that he was imprisoned. How do you see that?
So I've done some I've met with the film producer, the director, Kevin MacDonald and Muhammadu, and spoken about the film. And there's one thing I said to Muhammadu about the film. Muhammadu's a lovely character. I met him very briefly in Bagram. I didn't see him in Guantanamo. Guantanamo, most of the time, he spent totally isolated, separate from everybody else. But his character, Muhammadu, has a very likable character. And Hollywood likes him. And they like him because he's very forgiving. And that's a beautiful part of the spectrum of type of people that exist within Guantanamo. But there are others who are less forgiving and who want to talk about the other part of Guantanamo, which is what happens afterwards. Muhammadu suffered it for a while because he couldn't travel either. But here's one example. 23 prisoners were sent to the United Arab Emirates to be resettled. Where were they resettled? In a prison. One of those prisoners, his name was Hamidullah Tarakhail. He'd been imprisoned by the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, by the Americans in Guantanamo, and 4 years in UAE. He says the worst imprisonment he's ever tasted in his life
was
the UAE. He died 6 months after he was released. The others, all of these men, now these Yemenis. So here's the deal. America says that we can't send them to Yemen because it's too volatile. They're held for 6 years, the Yemenis, 6 years in UAE without charge or trial, unable to get any visits. And then at the end of that, where are they sent? Yemen.
Allah.
And so out of all of that group of 23, there's one prisoner that remains. His name is Ravil Mingazov. He's a Russian Tatar. and he has a son in in Leicester that he's never met. In Leicester.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
It's absolutely incredible.
So this is the part.
I think his son's in London now.
Yeah.
I met him a few
Did you
years
meet
back.
him? Yeah.
But what I mean, the point that you make was, which is quite interesting, is the fact that unlike Muhammadu, they're slightly less forgiving. They want to talk about what they saw and what they witnessed.
Yeah.
And they probably want to be, somehow recompense. I mean, how do you recompense someone who's spent 20 years away from their family and in isolation?
Even Muhammadu, Muhammadu, one of the most heartbreaking things in his story.
Yeah.
He says that they come to take him, the Mauritanian police, and they themselves are being pressed, ganged into doing something. Muhammadu is not wanted for anything in Mauritania.
Yeah.
He says goodbye to his mother.
Allah.
And he comes back. And she's not there anymore.
She's not there anymore. Yeah, I mean, it's
you can't. How are you going to?
How do you recompense?
I think the main thing that needs to happen, and is accountability. And I'm not talking about compensation in the form of money, but I would say that if we can see a process where the United States has to be held to account for what it's done, then at the end there would be money. But the first thing that is most important for former prisoners is that they remain tainted by having been declared enemy combatants without rights, never charged, never tried. The suspicion and the taint that attaches to this is worse than having been convicted of a crime.
Absolutely.
And yet the United States won't take responsibility for it. So
to this day, me and several people, I've documented a lot of this, to this day, whether you're traveling, whether you're opening accounts, bank accounts, whatever it is, and if you litigate, you'll find at the end of that litigation is a message by the United States of America saying that you were held in Guantanamo as an enemy combatant, suspected, and that hasn't left us. There's no process in which you can get exonerated because there was no process to put you there in the first place that was legally recognized. Right. So that stays with you forever, wherever you go.
So that's the thing, Moazzam, is that eventually what the United States government has to be compelled to do, if there is to be anything resembling justice for the men wrongly imprisoned, is that they have to commit to reviewing all the mistakes that they made so that we can get to a position where they accept that they have condemned people to a lifetime of suspicion and
But you
harassment.
See, Andy, in order to reach that point, the U.S. government, whoever's behind this, needs to rescind the very premise upon which Guantanamo was found. The very premise of what was the war on terror.
The problem with seeking justice from America on this accountability is that Guantanamo is still open for business. It's still running.
What do you do with that?
And so how are they going to reset it when they're still doing it?
Well, as you know, so that's the most urgent thing is that men are still held at Guantanamo who have been approved for release. There were two categories of men essentially at Guantanamo.
Were there any women, by the way? Just
not in Guantanamo.
Right.
Although there is a story I'll tell you afterwards when you finish this point. I'm going to tell you a story about that.
But we have to find anyone who's interested in Guantanamo as it is now after 21 years, the particular problems that there are men still held there. The thing we have to focus on this year is those 20 men approved for release and how in whatever way it is we can exert pressure on the United States government to release them, because the reason they haven't been freed is because the law still doesn't apply at Guantanamo. These men were approved for release through administrative review processes. This one's called the periodic review boards. It resembles a parole type process, but parole actually everywhere else in the judicial system, the criminal justice system, takes place after someone has been convicted of a crime. They've never been charged or tried.
And part of these review boards, you've got a member of 6 different U.S. departments, including law enforcement, including intelligence, including defense, and all of that stuff. And look, here's the irony. A large number of these people cleared for release are Yemenis, right? So they know you do not send them, no more prisoners can be sent to the United Arab Emirates. Some get sent to Oman and they're doing relatively well there. But what the past has shown is that you can release them to Yemen. In the end, that's what the UAE did. UAE exactly did that, and they're home and they're fine.
Yeah.
So you can. So once you've created a narrative for yourself and saying, well, Yemen's too unstable. Well, how stable is it to keep somebody tortured for 21 years and then to add another year on top?
Yeah.
Well, they can't. Unfortunately, though, the United States government can't release anyone to Yemen because U.S. law prohibits it. It was an accident that they were sent to the UAE and the UAE sent them back to Yemen. That wasn't supposed to happen. But it also happened under Trump.
Yeah.
And for those 4 years under Trump, there literally was no one in his government who had any responsibility for Guantanamo at all. He just
because he signed an executive order, isn't it, to close Guantanamo. He said he wanted to fill it up with more people. Yeah. Which was, I think, was playing to dudes. Yeah, bad dudes. As he called it.
You know, and on that point, fortunately, he was surrounded. Even the craziest people that he surrounded with himself with in high offices of state and in his government said, no, we're not sending new people to Guantanamo because it doesn't work.
But here's the amazing part of all this, right, Anas? I have to say. We've seen all this began in Afghanistan, didn't it? It was all, Al Qaeda is supposed to be there, the war on terrorists in Afghanistan, or the first invasions, and the Taliban and so forth. And a large number of the people in Guantanamo were there because they're associated with the Taliban.
Yeah.
Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State for Donald Trump, negotiated directly with the former Guantanamo prisoners in Doha, and that's where they began the agreement. He met with Khairullah Khairqa and Nurullah Nouri, who are now all ministers in their government, which is absolutely bizarre.
It's absurd.
And so what that tells you is that if you can negotiate with the top leaders of the Taliban, why did you start the fight to begin with?
Exactly. No, I always tell this, by the way. I always tell this story, but it's sometimes when something that you feel is absolutely absurd you just keep telling the story because it's so unbelievable. I try to convince myself that I remember during the first term of Obama, around 2009, 2010 probably, I was attending an international conference in Doha, and I was kept at the Sheraton Hotel, very swanky, very nice, but the official residence of international conferences when it comes to Qatar. And I remember coming down early for breakfast one day, around 6:30. And as soon as you leave the elevators, you're in front of the open-spaced restaurant where breakfast is had. And virtually no one was there. It was way too early. But meeting me was the spectacle of John Kerry, who was then what was he? He wasn't the first time. He wasn't the Secretary of State. He was something else. He had another position. Surrounded by about 8 or 9 of the leaders of Taliban, sitting having a lavish breakfast. And
what year was this?
This was around 2009, 2010.
Okay, so this is before the release of the Taliban.
Yes. And I just stood there for a few seconds thinking, what is this? Is this a setup? The first thing that occurred to me was that maybe someone had actually pranked John Kerry into having this. But I had my breakfast, and for the entirety of that time, the half hour or 40 minutes that I was there were laughs, there were the translation of jokes, they were talking about personal stuff. And
I'm assuming then that Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif was there. So he's the former,
yes.
Yeah, so he's a good friend of mine, a very good friend of mine. He was the ambassador from Pakistan. He was the spokesman of the Taliban before. Yes. He's no longer part of the government. But
it's just absurd to the extent that you're in total disbelief. What is going on here? But one thing that I always come back to, how much of the responsibility for Guantanamo and what's happened therein lies on our government here in the UK.
Ooh. Huge.
How so?
My personal belief, having dealt with just the UK cases, I know for a fact I would not have gone to Guantanamo had it not been for the British government and its involvement, and the involvement particularly of the security services here.
Wow.
And we know that from the agents involved, from the presence of MI5 officers who came to my house here before I went, who turned up at Bagram when there was a gun put to my head, who turned up in Guantanamo, in the cases of several others, in the case of Bishr al-Rawi and Jamil al-Banna, who were British citizens and residents rendered from Gambia, in the case of Shakir Ahmed. The minimum you could say is that they were complicit and knew and facilitated the questioning and actually questioned their own citizens whilst they're getting tortured. And I mean to the point of when I spoke of the taxi driver being murdered, that is when the British agents were hovering around and asking questions of their own citizens. And I made them aware of it. So their role from the use of the island of Diego Garcia, which they claimed was a conspiracy theory, which now has been, it's clear that the Diego Garcia was used as a place to stop over and hold torture, people who were being tortured and rendered then to different countries like Abu Zubaydah and others. And of course, the very physical presence in Bagram and the facilitation of, I've met people from other countries, not just Britons, who were interrogated by British intelligence. There's also an investigation by the British police into whether MI5 agents were involved in the abuse of Abu Zubaydah, not just the CIA. So there's Britain always in almost every conflict, maybe some not like Vietnam, is always there with America. And in this one, it was hand in glove. And it wasn't, to begin with, a right-wing government. It was the new Labour government of Tony Blair.
And we know, I mean, mentioning Tony Blair, we know the fact that there was virtually an admission that British subjects were sent to countries like Syria, like Libya and the such in order to be tortured. One of them, Abdul Hakim Balhaj, I mean, the famous case whereby he and his wife were renditioned
I went
to Libya.
To Libya. I took the lawyers from here to Libya to meet with him, to meet with Samir Saadi. And clearly, up until this point, the British government had been denying everything, right? But the evidence didn't come from the British government.
No, it came from
the Libyan rebels themselves, who found the documents which said there's been intelligence exchange.
And that's how Abdul Hakim secured the admission and the apology for £1.
Only £1. Although his wife got £1, and the apology was the most important thing. It's been the only apology by a British government. In Canada's case, it's interesting because you mentioned Syria and others, right? So there were a bunch of Syrians, Canadian Syrians, who were handed over, or the Canadian government was complicit in their torture. But the Canadian government has apologized to every one of those Canadians, including Umar Khadr, who is a Canadian Egyptian held in Guantanamo as a child, lost his eye. Again, I saw him in Bagram, where he came in emaciated, cut to pieces, gunshot wounds through his shoulder, eye lost, and he's a 14-year-old kid. And it took them almost 14 years to bring him back home and say, we're sorry.
Which was shameful on the part of both the US government and the Canadian government. So it was Obama who actually was the president when a former child was prosecuted in the military commissions for having allegedly engaged in a firefight during a war, and having to be put in a position of claiming that was a war crime so that he could be released from Guantanamo. And then the Canadian government dragging their heels over actually getting him home from Guantanamo.
I can't tell you, Anas. They brought that kid into Bagram, and I remember, I'll never forget it. His body was ripped to pieces, and he never complained. I never heard a word of complaint from him. They would torture him. They would drag him out of his cell, make him pile up crates of water with his hands shackled and his legs shackled. And this is while he's lost his eye. And they'd make him pile up as much as he could. Then they'd boot it down and make him do it again and again and again. And sometimes I'd see there's a tear trickling from his eye. And I couldn't tell whether that's because he's wounded in his eye or he's crying. But you'd never hear him complain at all, which was more than I could say with some of the adults.
You said you'd come back to the women in Guantanamo.
Yeah. So there was this girl. She contacts me. She's got a hijab on Facebook, and she says, brother, were you in Guantanamo? I said, yeah, I was. She said, so was I. I said,
when was this?
This was about 10 odd years ago.
Right.
I said, there weren't any female prisoners in Guantanamo. She says, I wasn't a prisoner. I was one of your guards.
Allah.
Oh.
And I said, wow. I said, tell me, like, I've become Muslim. She said, yeah. I became a Muslim because I saw the prisoners, how they behaved there. First of all, she said, and something I know for a fact, there's abuse against females in the US military is massive. It's huge. Yeah. And she said that when I'd encountered something like this, I'd never seen the prisoners behaving this way. They were very respectful, keep the eyes down. And so I saw that the weak amongst you was made stronger by your brothers. And I found that something deeply empowering because I felt I'd become weaker by the way I was treated. Wow. So I said, I promised that I would go back home, learn about this faith, and I accepted Islam.
SubhanAllah. Okay, so if we were to ask British officials today, what's the official line? What's the official policy on Guantanamo?
Oh, God. Tell us, Andy. Andy was at 10 Downing Street the other day.
I was. On Saturday, we held a vigil in central London, and then we had arranged to deliver.
Oh, so you were outside 10 Downing Street. You weren't inside. I was going to ask you about the brand of cookies that they serve.
No. We delivered a letter calling on, Rishi Sunak to pick up the phone and, express support for the closure of Guantanamo and urge President Biden to close it. And, and I also made sure that we put in the letter that we think that Rishi Sunak should offer to take in at least one or two of these men held at Guantanamo, proof for release, who can't be sent back to their home countries. Of course, I have absolutely no hope that he will do anything because I don't think that he would have the slightest interest in Guantanamo. And also, we have the most racist and obnoxious Home Secretary in living memory, who also wouldn't do anything. So that's not great. But I do think that it's what those of us who are interested in Guantanamo need to do over this coming year is to start to try and make inroads into the European Parliament again, just to raise the issue there of European countries accepting some of these men who can't be returned to their home countries. Because one of the things it highlights is we are not asking you to take in dangerous people. Yeah. These are people who were dressed up as dangerous in the first place. And one of the things I meant to mention earlier, actually, Moazzam, when you were talking about resettlements in Europe, countries who are asked to resettle prisoners are given the files from Guantanamo that are full of lies about who they're supposed to be. I know that because when these resettlements were taking place, I would sometimes get calls from journalists in these countries saying, we've heard that this person is going to be taken in by our government, but the allegations against them are that they're this, this, and this. And I would have to explain to them that those allegations were groundless, that there was no reason to believe that any of the stories against these prisoners were accurate.
And there's another thing to that, Andy, though, of course. I always say, well, the Americans are not going to release anybody to these countries without having vetted them. And there are no more better vetted people on the planet. Who have they been vetted by? FBI, military intelligence, CIA, MI5, MI6, and in some cases, their own host countries. Do you know that Chinese intelligence came to Guantanamo to interrogate the Uyghurs? So in the war on terrorism, Libyan intelligence came, Egyptian intelligence came, Jordanian intelligence, and you name the intelligence agency, they were there taking part. They were
all the Western
all
countries,
of them,
not just Britain.
Yeah, not just Britain, not just Britain at all. In fact, everybody took part. As I said, even the Chinese. So what Russian intelligence? It tells you there everything you need to know that this war on terrorism was. Everybody took part. This is a what is it? Murder on the Orient Express. Yeah. Everybody sticks a knife in.
But it's a dirty secret, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it was kind of a free for all for intelligence. It's like, guys, we've set up a facility where the rules don't apply. Come on in and interrogate.
And so you can see from this, Anas, for example, politics dictated because the Uyghurs, and they told me this, that became a bargaining chip to try to get China on board for the invasion of Iraq. The Uyghurs. Put them on the terrorist list, and we won't say anything. Now politics has turned around. The same US government has taken the Uyghurs off the terrorist list and put the Chinese government under sanctions, the Communist Party. So it's just a political game in which the rule of law doesn't matter.
And this is the problem, you see. And firstly, because I feel that a precedent has been set. And it's been proven that if you have the political clout or might, that you can create a paralegal space whereby you do whatever you want to do. And that's incredibly problematic. I mean, if you were to challenge China, for instance, or Russia, or India, or any other country about their human rights abuses, they would readily point to the bastion of democracy.
And they do.
And say, well, speak to them.
And you'll be shocked, my friend. I was contacted just last year, because it was the 20th anniversary of Guantanamo, by the Xinhua news agency in China, which is the Chinese. And they interviewed me about Guantanamo. They want me to hammer Guantanamo and America as a result. So I did. But then I ended when they said, is there any message you'd like to give to the Chinese? I said, yeah, you make Guantanamo look like kindergarten. Because like everything else, you do detention on an industrial scale without charge or trial. And the Uyghurs in Guantanamo say, thank God we were sent to Guantanamo, not to China.
Not to China.
You know,
it's a very important, end of this story is that the United States must be obliged to repudiate everything that Guantanamo stands for, because you're right. It leaches out around the world the malevolent influence of the United States having said, we tore up everything, guys. We can hold these Muslim guys forever without charge or trial. And it's significant that no one has been sent to Guantanamo since the spring of 2008. It's significant that Donald Trump wanted to fill it with bad guys, but was told, no, we're not using Guantanamo. It doesn't work. Because if you have a case against somebody, you need to use the courts. Guantanamo, it doesn't work. We want to torture people, said Donald Trump. They said, we did the torture program. That also didn't work. This isn't benevolence. As we were saying, they kill people in drone killings now, rather than having to bother with that whole messy business of apprehending people. But what has to happen in the end is that the United States needs to recognize what a huge mistake it was. And, and as we've been talking about, they don't want to do that because it underpins so much, but it was. And we know
Is there any recourse to address this? Let's be
legally,
fanciful here. Let's talk about the United Nations. I mean, there's a high commission for.
Well, let me say this: I've taken part in a multitude of different legal processes. One is I gave evidence to the Metropolitan Police for the role of MI5. So MI5 was investigated by the police, and they came back in the end after 2 to 3 years of investigation, saying we can't continue because the government and the US are refusing to cooperate. Imagine that. A police investigation. ICC. We gave evidence to the ICC, the International Criminal Court, who were investigating Taliban, Afghan National Army, and the US. The US responded by saying, and I kid you not, any person from the ICC who tries to investigate or prosecute any member of the US government will be sanctioned, prosecuted, and arrested.
And their assets confiscated.
And they did that.
I remember translating that into Arabic.
They did that to Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, who was put under US sanctions. To the Intelligence and Security Committee here, we gave evidence here again. It ended up in nothing. They said, yes, some irregularities happened. British agents kind of knew what was going on, but not really. We've learned lessons for the future. Won't do it again. We gave evidence to the judge-led independent inquiry by Sir Peter Gibson. Again, that came to nothing because we would never be able to put our representatives or us would never be able to see the evidence that they'd gathered against us. Or what methods they'd used. So in the end, what this was is that the entirety of this system was closing ranks. There is nowhere to get justice.
I get the feeling that, I wanted to pose the question whether we've learnt anything, whether any lessons have been learnt, but I know what the answer will be. And if anything, if lessons have been learnt, is how to close down the loopholes.
I was just going to say, the torture, Abu Zubaydah's torture, the torture of Abdurrahim and Nasir, and all those guys who were waterboarded, this medieval torture technique, they were videoed. They were all videoed. But what did the CIA do?
Mm-hmm.
They destroyed the
They
tapes.
destroyed them.
And who gave them the immunity?
Yeah.
Obama.
There we go.
I think what we've learned, and I think the United States government, apart from the far right lunatic fringes, knows that everything that happened was wrong and failed. That there were better ways to do things if you were looking for intelligence. All of it.
Yeah.
The problem is that they replaced all of it with killing people with drones, and
That's it.
And what underpins both of those, which is so horrible, is that it's in defiance of the law.
Yeah.
It stands outside of the law. But drones is worse than Guantanamo, isn't it, Moazzam? Because they kill you in a drone attack, you're dead. You're in Guantanamo, you can eventually be freed.